Welcome to the IWP podcast, coming to you live from the Institute of World Politics in Washington, D.C. I'm Jim Robbins, Dean of Academics at IWP, an accredited graduate school of national security, intelligence, and international affairs, offering a variety of certificates, master's degrees, and doctorates, both in person and online. You can check out our programs and our courses at our website, iwp.edu. Israel's War Cabinet has reportedly decided how to respond to Iran's recent attack, but the timing and scope of the response are not yet known. Last weekend, the Islamic Republic of Iran launched Operation True Promise, a missile and drone strike against Israel. The attack began late Saturday evening and ended early in the morning Sunday. Iran launched around 300 weapons, according to the U.S. Defense Department. Among the weapons launched from locations in Iran, Syria, and Yemen were over 110 medium-range ballistic missiles, more than 30 land attack cruise missiles, and over 150 uncrewed aerial vehicles. Israel and coalition forces intercepted 99% of the incoming Iranian weapons. Israel's air defense system, including Iron Dome, accounted for most, but the DoD said U.S. Central Command forces, supported by the U.S. Navy destroyers USS Arleigh Burke and USS Carney, destroyed more than 80 attack UAVs and at least 6 of the ballistic missiles. Countries involved in the intercept were the United States, Israel, Jordan, the United Kingdom, and France, with assistance from Saudi Arabia, which the Saudis stated publicly. Recall that one of the reasons why Hamas started this war on October 7th was to drive a wedge between Israel and Saudi Arabia, but instead they have driven them closer together. Iran's operation did very little material damage, and there was only one reported casualty, 7-year-old Amina Hassouna, who was seriously injured when debris from an intercepted ballistic missile struck her on the head at her family's home in a Bedouin village in the southern Negev. As of latest reports, Amina is still in serious condition. Iran's attack was revenge for an airstrike on April 1st, presumably Israeli, which hit the Iranian consulate annex next to Iran's embassy in Damascus, Syria. 16 people were killed, including Brigadier General Mohammad Reza Zahidi, a senior Quds Force commander of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, along with other IRGC officers. Iran's UN mission in New York said on X that last weekend's attack should be taken as its promised response to the strike on its diplomatic compound, and that the matter can be deemed concluded. However, they said, should the Israeli regime make another mistake, Iran's response will be considerably more severe. It is a conflict between Iran and the rogue Israeli regime from which the U.S. must stay away. That last part was in all caps, so you know they really, really mean it. Also note that the Iranians seized a Portuguese-flagged vessel, MSC Ares, near the Strait of Hormuz, adding another layer to the crisis. It was soon clear that Tehran had crossed a line with Operation True Promise. In the past, the Iranians have always utilized proxies to conduct their attacks. Or even if using IRGC forces, they were attacking not from Iran, but from Iraq or Syria or elsewhere. This time, there was no plausible deniability, no fig leaf. It was a state-to-state act of aggression. It immediately changed the debate over what's going on in the Middle East, and at least temporarily rallied opinion regarding Israel. Case in point, the statement from the G7 group of nations. We, the leaders of the G7, unequivocally condemn in the strongest terms Iran's direct and unprecedented attack against Israel. Iran fired hundreds of drones and missiles towards Israel. Israel, with the help of its partners, defeated the attack. We express our full solidarity and support for Israel and its people and reaffirm our commitment towards its security. Meanwhile, the United States is imposing a new round of sanctions. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said, "These new sanctions and other measures will continue a steady drumbeat of pressure to contain and degrade Iran's military capacity and effectiveness, and confront the full range of its problematic behaviors." Okay, so it's not Churchillian prose, but at least policy is moving in the right direction. It's interesting how the overt nature of Iran's attack was so compelling when the shadow war has been going on for some time. The Iranians and the Israelis have been in direct conflict, mainly in Syria, but also elsewhere. Whether it is actions against Iran's nuclear program or nuclear scientists, or tit-for-tat attacks involving Iranian proxies in Syria or Lebanon, the ongoing violence around Gaza, not just recently, but for years, or Houthi attacks against Israel and Saudi Arabia, the war's been going on for some time. If you want to include actions against the United States, we could go back to Iranian-backed attacks on the U.S. in the Iraq War, or the 1980s in Lebanon and the Gulf. So it's hardly news that Iran is an aggressor state. But there was a qualitative difference in the political response to this attack, since it originated in Iran, and Iran claimed responsibility for it. It represented clear escalation from their usual way of doing business. There were some similarities to Iran's revenge attack after the United States took out Qasem Soleimani in 2020. Then, as now, Iran telegraphed its intentions, made a limited strike, and then rather ceremoniously declared an end to hostilities, reserving the right for future action should it be necessary. And, like the Soleimani revenge attack, the weekend operation didn't result in substantial damage, although it was a much larger operation and faced a determined defense by Israel and other countries. So we have Iran's MO in these general killing situations. Threats, an attack that doesn't accomplish much, a formal declaration that they made their point, and more finger-wagging not to offend them again. Iran's attack was such a spectacular failure that apologists floated the narrative that Tehran was not using its best or most effective weapons because they only wanted to send a message, not achieve a military victory. Had they wanted to, they could have done much worse. Indeed, that's what Iran said in their threatening tweet. And the New York Times ran with this narrative, saying the attack seemed designed to create maximum drama while inflicting minimal damage. This was according to unnamed defense officials and military experts. Where would we be without the experts? The Times claimed that Iran sequenced the attack in such a way that both Israelis and Americans were able to adjust their aerial defenses once the Iranian missiles and drones were in the air. Few of Iran's drones and missiles found their intended targets, and an accuracy level that military experts and defense officials say was probably by design. See, whatever happened was all according to Iran's cunning plan. The utter failure to inflict significant damage was a huge win for Tehran. We fell right into their ingenious trap by successfully mounting a coordinated air defense that took down 99% of their weapons. Honestly, can you believe these people? There's always a danger in downgrading our perceptions of enemy intentions when using force. To say that Iran wasn't really trying means the fact that their attack failed doesn't matter, since by this reasoning, all they were doing was sending a message. It was irrelevant whether their strikes were successful. Instead, it was, as the Times said, a highly choreographed spectacle. This is how the United States lost the narrative struggle over the Tet Offensive during the Vietnam War. The Tet Offensive was an attempt by the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong to create a mass uprising in South Vietnam to win the war. That was their objective, victory. But they completely miscalculated the reaction of the South Vietnamese people, as well as the response of United States and South Vietnamese forces. So the Tet Offensive became a military disaster for the communists. But because the offensive was recast as merely an attempt by the communists to send a message, or another highly choreographed spectacle, opponents of the U.S. war effort were able to call it a victory for Hanoi. And you can read all about how that happened in my Amazon #1 Vietnam War book, This Time We Win, Revisiting the Tet Offensive. Okay, shameless plug, but the point is relevant. The same thing is at work here, an attempt to explain away Iranian weakness and make the coalition victory seem meaningless. But you can guess that Iran's friends and proxies in the region, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi militant groups, and others, were shocked at the extent of the failure of this attack. Maybe Iran isn't the emerging regional hegemon that they thought it was. Iran's barrage also, at least temporarily, changed the debate about what's happening in the Middle East and resurrected Israel's reputation. Before the attack, the main focus was what Israel was doing in Gaza, the ongoing negotiations with Hamas, and the prospect of a ceasefire, which was being pushed especially by the United States. After the attack, there was more of a rallying around Israel, and Hamas chose that moment to substantially increase its demands at the ceasefire negotiations to a point so unreasonable that even the United States released statements noting that the Hamas position was a non-starter. Hamas was asking for such things as withdrawing all Israeli forces, allowing the free movement of Gazans to wherever they want to go without being interrogated or detained, and making the ceasefire permanent, in other words, ending the war. And doing all these things before even a few of the hostages being held by Hamas would be released. Earlier, the negotiators had settled on 40 hostages to be freed, which Hamas abruptly halved to 20. Bear in mind that Hamas says it doesn't know where the hostages are, and no one seems to know how many of them are still alive. These moves came just as Israel was making conciliating gestures to the United States, allowing in more humanitarian aid, and bargaining in good faith towards a ceasefire. So this was a lose-lose for Hamas. Now the question is, how does Israel respond, and where do we go from here? One possible response is a counterstrike from Israel to Iran. This is something that the United States does not want, and said it would not support. That is no surprise, since the Biden administration's policy in every conflict is not to widen the war. From Ukraine to the Houthis to Gaza and now to Iran, the message coming out of the White House is the same. Please stop. Go no further. Don't make it worse. And above all, for the U.S. and its allies, don't do anything that might approach victory. Israel may be able to take advantage of the fact that the United States is very much opposed to a strike. This was the case during Gulf War I, when Saddam Hussein was launching Scuds at Israel, and the George H.W. Bush administration was highly concerned that the conflict would escalate. That was what Saddam intended, of course, to bring Israel into the war, disrupt the coalition, which included many Arab states, especially Egypt and Syria, and change the political calculus of the conflict. Instead, Israel restrained itself, and the United States began a furious scud hunt in western Iraq. It's worth looking back at January and February 1991. The Iraqis launched 42 scuds at Israel, mainly targeting areas around Tel Aviv and Haifa. 4,100 buildings were damaged and almost 30 destroyed in those attacks. 2 people were killed, and dozens of others died from heart attacks or other circumstances. So Saddam's attacks in 1991 were much more damaging, and Israel's restraint much greater compared to the situation they're facing today. Israel may lose whatever goodwill it has temporarily gained by conducting a massive counterstrike. But some type of action would show strength in a region where that sort of puissance is valued. If Israel does take more direct action against Iran, reports say it will be limited in scope and coordinated with regional allies, including Arab states. Partly for overflight permission, partly to show respect, and to defend regional interests of countries that have no interest in Iran accruing more power. It would also take place against Iranian forces, but outside of Iran itself. Iran's president, Ibrahim Raisi, threatened a severe, extensive, and painful retaliation against even the smallest action. Iran pledges to respond in seconds and says it will employ a weapon never before used. If nothing else, Israel has benefited from a sudden infusion of backbone in American statements about the situation in the Middle East. The White House seems to have realized that Iran is the problem. They understand finally that Hamas is not actually seeking to negotiate in good faith, and they have ramped back somewhat on the anti-Israel messaging of previous weeks. So going along with the American idea of not responding to the Iranian attack, or at least not responding in a major way, may keep this feel-good moment going. And it's not like the Israelis can't do anything. The Northern Front is still active. For example, on Tuesday, the IDF confirmed the elimination of Mohammed Shouri, rocket and missile commander in Hezbollah's Radwan force. 2 other Hezbollah commanders were also killed in separate attacks. Hezbollah responded with a rocket attack on the Bedouin village of Arab al-Aramshi in northern Israel, wounding at least 18. Actions like this will be ongoing and apparently don't count as retaliation against Iran, but just against Hezbollah. Meanwhile, as Hamas is looking increasingly desperate, holed up in their last remaining bastions in Gaza, and with Israel feeling confident enough to be able to withdraw most of its troops from Gaza, for the time being, this may be a good time to take stock. With more humanitarian aid going into Gaza, and with more Gazans moving to other areas within the Strip, Israel is unilaterally implementing aspects of its own ceasefire conditions. And U.S. objectives are essentially being met without a ceasefire formally being declared. This gives Israel freedom of action to respond to circumstances should Hamas fighters or leaders pop out. For example, the airstrike on a vehicle in Rafah on Tuesday, which took out unspecified terrorists. With the troop drawdown, Israel is tempting the terrorists to show themselves. And they would not be violating a ceasefire by taking them out if none has been declared. If the United States wants to prevent a major offensive in Rafah, spend less time lecturing Israel and more time calling for Hamas to surrender. This would be a good time to mount information operations aimed at Gazans, asking them to expose the Hamas hideouts, to act as agents of their own liberation from the suffering the terrorists have caused them. Offer rewards for members of the Hamas leadership, maybe a deck of cards like we had in Iraq. Stop lecturing Israel and be part of the solution. So after Operation True Promise, Iran comes out of it looking aggressive, desperate, and ineffective. Hamas looks disorganized, combative, and unreasonable. And Israel, for the moment, has regained some diplomatic stature. It shouldn't take large-scale attacks on Israel for the international community to recognize the legitimacy of the struggle against Iranian-backed terrorism. And a little more solidarity in pushing back against Tehran's disruptive efforts in the region would go a long way to reestablishing stability in the Middle East. It's great that the United States took decisive action in blunting Iran's unprecedented attack. Let's keep that energy going. Thanks for tuning in. If you like this podcast, please share and subscribe. For IWP, I'm Jim Robbins. Join us next week for another edition of the IWP Podcast.